Let's start next lecture. Dr. Christine Dennehy is professor and a chair of history at California State University, Fullerton, where she teaches Korean, Japanese, and world history, as well as seminars in historical methodology. She has studied at Yonsei University in Korea and her dissertation, UCLA, in 2002. Memories of Colonial Korea in Post-War Japan, focused on evaluations of Japanese imperialism in Korea by ethnic Koreans in Japan and former colonial officials in the late 1940s and 1950s. Since 2016, she has served as a National Screening Committee member for the Fulbright Commission in Korea.
Morning, everybody. Morning. Thanks for having me. And I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit. Thank you, Ms. Kim, for the introduction. And just to let you know that my background actually is not history. And so I was kind of heartened when Jennifer asked, what grades do you teach, what subjects? That was helpful for me to know because originally my first love was language. And so that's how I got interested in Korean history and Korean studies was through the language, and it was first actually through Japanese language and Japanese history is my main field. So I'm coming at my presentation today from a little bit of a different perspective, I think, than maybe some of the other speakers and experts whose main field or ethnic background is in Korean studies or is from Korea. So just a little bit of an anecdote about my own background that I think will link to some of the comments that I'm going to make is when I studied in Japan, people would ask me, why are you interested in Japan and Korea? They look at me and they say, you're not Japanese, you're not Korean. Sometimes they would look at me and they say, you half Asian? No, just because of the subject area. But when they heard my name was Dennehy and they heard that my family background was Irish, scholars in Korea and Japan would make that connection and say, well, that accounts for it because the Irish were so oppressed by the British for so many years that you have this kind of DNA, genetic sympathy with Koreans who had been colonized by the Japanese so brutally. And there's that kind of sympathy and interest, which may or may not be the case, but what I'd like to do today is, let's see, I'm going to slide forward. When we talk about 19th and early 20th century Korean history and Japanese imperialism, what I'd like to do is put it in the context of world history. And I think this is important also because I've been doing a lot of work with scholars from Japan and Korea and China. They have these kind of collaborative historical symposiums that I've been a part of the last several years. And the Korean scholars in particular are very interested in putting Korean history in global perspective to get out of just this very narrow kind of nation-state focused approach to history and to culture and to look at the Korean linkages. So I'm glad that I was here with Jennifer's presentation earlier where she made some connections to other parts of world history. So I'm going to do that kind of on a regular basis throughout my presentation today. Also, I'm happy to, we've got about an hour, and I'm happy to stop for questions along the way. So I know that it seemed like Jennifer's, the way she allotted the time was to have the questions and some ideas for lesson plans towards the end. But please feel free if there's anything that needs clarification or you want to jump in the meantime. I'm happy to pause and do it that way. So what I want to start out with is incorporating Korean history into world history. We need to think about late 19th century imperialism and industrialization. These are global trends that had very significant consequences for the Korean peninsula. There was a real shift. So 19th century. With my students, I teach both lower division world history survey as well as more specialized upper division history classes, but I find with the lower division for the college students, 19th century, sometimes they think that means 1900. So I always have to clarify, right, when we talk about late 19th century imperialism, what we're talking about is from the 1850s onward. And so what I want to do is put this in at least a regional perspective. What are the implications for Korea when we have things like steamships, when we have things also associated with industrialization that caused countries, imperialist countries like the United States, like France, like Britain, like Germany, to use these new kinds of technologies and to explore and to travel and to take an interest in other parts of the world using the technology, especially things like the steamship and the railway. So that's the first bullet point there, is just to get you thinking about the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and then what's going on in terms of changes in technology, changes in industrialization. So cotton manufacturing, for instance, right? We've got factories and we've got the use of coal and different kinds of resources to fuel economic development in different parts of the world. And so the second point here, the shift from Sinocentrism, what happens in the case of East Asia is, I'm going to just give you kind of a narrow window here. What I want to talk about is the Americans. So 1850, Commodore Perry goes from Rhode Island to East Asia. And he forces the Japanese ports open. Japan has been relatively closed for 250 years. And so what happens is the Japanese realize, wait a minute, here come the Americans with their steamships. We better sign their treaties or else they're going to attack us the way they did, if just to back up a little bit to the 1840s, the Opium War. People, raise your hand if you've heard of the Opium War, you have some kind of sense. Basically, right, it's the British forcing open the Chinese ports. And so you've got a real shift now in what's happening in East Asia and their interactions with countries like Britain and the United States. And so you have different trajectories of modernization. This is one thing that I'm going to come back to that I think is important to think about when we think about industrialization in Korea and in East Asia, is that you've got this push now to force open ports. You've got kind of a forced industrialization. This wasn't necessarily something organic that grew up in Korean society. It was basically the Japanese ports were forced open. 20 years later, after the 1850s, by the 1870s, the Japanese now are learning from the West. They're getting a lot of advisors. Anyone seen the movie The Last Samurai? Right, so in The Last Samurai, you've got Westerners come in, and so you've got a really, Jennifer talked before about kind of a really rapid shift. Once the Korean society, like with the cremation, right, decides to do something differently, it happens really quickly. So we can think about that same kind of change in culture and practices in the late 19th century in the case of Japan, right? We're going to open up to the West because we have to, and so we're going to do the same thing to Korea. And so this shift from Sinocentrism, what we mean by that is that instead of that sphere that Jennifer talked about, right, China kind of is the center of civilization, right, Chinese characters and writing, Confucian text, you've got countries like Japan and Korea and Vietnam looking up to China as a center of civilization. That whole kind of world order, that regional hierarchy of what it means to be civilized, to know the Confucian classics, to be able to take an exam, right, as a yangban, as a scholar bureaucrat, and be able to study and be able to get a position in the government, those kinds of things now are really shifting in the 19th century. And so these Confucian legacies, in the case of Korea, end up being kind of a problem, right? The Yangbang and the officials, they say, wait, how are we going to deal with this new world order, right? We're civilized, we have maintained traditions, right? Let's just kind of sit tight. And so the definition of civilization is changing, right? The Japanese come, they force open Korean ports. This is kind of a crucial time period, a real turning point in Korean history is the 1870s. You have this treaty in the 1870s that basically forces open Korean ports. And so the different definition of civilization changes. it becomes kind of more Western infused. And so civilization means to be modern. It means to be industrialized. It means to have kind of a rational way of collecting taxes, not just based on custom, right? Jennifer gave you the different social classes in Confucianism, and peasants were kind of on the bottom, but they were definitely important in an agriculturally based economy. And so these kinds of social relations and Confucian traditions are really changing. And so what I put down at the bottom here, social Darwinism, this is also really key to changes that make their way into East Asia. So I'm going to kind of throw it out to the floor here. Who can give me a definition of social Darwinism, right? When we use the term social Darwinism, and we're going to think about it in relation to Korea, right? What do we mean?
People most fit to survive are the ones who deserve to be on the top.
Yeah.
And the people who are on the bottom deserve to be there because they're not fit. They didn't work hard or whatever.
Yeah. Right, so Darwin was a biologist or a naturalist, and so he's looking at things like bird beaks, right? If you can get that seed out of the tree with your beak, right, you're more evolved, you're fittest, and so you survive because you can get that nut out of the tree. And so social Darwinism is an idea. This is, again, putting Korea in the global context. This is kind of a global phenomenon, global imperial trend, that imperialist countries use this notion of social Darwinism to justify their control over other areas of the world. And so in the case of Korea, this happened in the case of Japan, coming in and saying, look, we're more civilized, we've modernized more rapidly, we've built factories more rapidly, we've done land reform more rapidly, we've done all of these things, and now we're going to be the bearers of civilization to Korea. So again, I want to just take a minute and step back and say, what I'm presenting here, right, is the mindset of the time. I don't want you to get the impression that these are my views, right, the Japanese are more civilized, right? What we're doing is we're going back in time, we're looking at the 19th century, trying to get a sense of the mindset and where Korean society was affected. Did you have a question?
I mean, it was the same here. We went into
It
was the same here. We went into the Philippines, and the explicit aim was to Christianize them.
Right, so obviously in the case of the Japanese, they weren't trying to Christianize them, right? What it meant, this is interesting, I'm glad you mentioned that, because what it meant to be civilized in the late 19th century, as you say, for the Americans in the Philippines, to be civilized meant to be Christian, right? For enslaved people in the Americas, right, that process of Christianity and Christianization. But this is what's kind of unique about the case of colonial Korea, is that they were dominated by a country that actually had a common Confucian heritage. So the Japanese colonial officials actually used that to their advantage. Right, there was actually this common kind of cultural similarity that bureaucrats and teachers and just general people, Japanese people in Korea, could use as a way to exert their control. The other thing that I want to add, Jennifer mentioned the geography, is that if you look at the world map, that Korea is kind of unusual in that its colonizer, Japan, was so geographically close. Right, think about the case, tell me your name here. I can't see your name tag. George? George, right? So George mentioned the U.S. and Philippines. They're very far apart geographically, right? There are a lot of cultural and geographical differences. And so in the case of Korea, that there was a similarity of eating rice, right? Rice culture, different kinds of agricultural products, the fact that both Japan and Korea were in this Sinocentric sphere. So I want to kind of lay the groundwork here to give you a sense of some of the particularities of Korea in the late 19th century, but then how this is also part of some broader global trends. Right, so this is that gunboat diplomacy that we were talking about, the Opium Wars, and so we use this term realpolitik, right, realpolitik. What's the reality, right? What's the on-the-ground practical things that governments need to do? And so for the Japanese, what they realized was they were subject to unequal treaties in the 1850s. And so, as I say, 20 years later, very quickly, they imposed these same kind of unequal treaties on Korea. And so this is part, I think some of you, raise your hand if you've heard about tension between Japan and Korea. Right? So probably at some level or related to some issue, there are elements of tension that I'd like to think about today in a historical perspective. And so one of them, right, if you go back far enough, you go back to the 1870s, you look at how the Japanese imposed these unequal treaties on Korea. And they were unequal in two ways, right? So they were unequal in terms of economics, that the Koreans couldn't set their own tariffs. So that gave the Japanese an economic advantage. So if they wanted to sell things like soybeans or silk or other kinds of commodities, that they had a kind of control and a kind of wherewithal that was similar to other Western imperial powers to impose these kinds of restrictions on the Korean economy. And by the way, right, this is something that gets lost oftentimes today, is the kind of pat on the back that the Japanese were getting from other Western imperialist powers. And so part of the tension today, right, if we say, oh, the Koreans see themselves as we were treated unfairly, right, from the Japanese perspective, again, not to justify it, not to agree with it, but to say that the mindset was, right, the Japanese officials feel like this is part of the New World Order. We're doing things the right way, the civilized way. So the unequal treaties, they were unequal economically, but another really important aspect that made them unequal was that now the Koreans were unequal legally, politically. So for instance, if an American were to go to Korea in the 1880s, right, what the unequal treaties meant was that if an American committed a crime, he wouldn't be subject to Korean law, right? So it's unequal, right? It should be sovereign territory. The Koreans should get the say in what happens to somebody if they commit a crime, shouldn't they? Well, no, not if you're in the 19th century, right? And the powers that be say, oh no, you're not civilized, right? You had that legacy of slavery that Jennifer talked about, which is really ironic, right? Because the Civil War just ended in the United States, right? Or, right, look at the Korean legal system. They do things like flog their prisoners, whip them, right? That's uncivilized. We don't want us Americans to be subject to that kind of uncivilized, arbitrary legal system. So these are kind of two key words that were associated with the Western mindset towards Koreans were, right, uncivilized and the arbitrary system of law, right? Unless you reform your legal system and your economic system to be in line with what the rest of the world is doing, right, you're going to be subject to this new kind of hierarchy. So I think that's another thing to think about is that you have a Confucian hierarchy. If you go back to Jennifer's PowerPoint and look at the Confucian class structure, you've got a real overhaul and a real different sense now, quite quickly in the 19th century, of what it means to be in a hierarchy in terms of global powers. So 19th century capitalism and trade, right, we talked about that a little bit with the steamship. So the capitalism, the capitalist economic system driving the expansion, right? If you think about even, outside of East Asia, right, the scramble for Africa, right, that was about mid-19th century, right? Capitalism, right, and capitalist economic system drove the exploration and inroads into Africa to look for things like rubber, right? Natural resources that were part of a different kind of trading system, a different kind of manufacturing system, right? So a similar kind of thing in East Asia, the Japanese manufacturing, silk manufacturing, soybean production, rice production, right? Those kinds of agricultural commodities like rice and soybeans are now part of a global capitalist economic system. And I put down here, this is important, I think, especially for us here in Southern California, the long-term historical perspective that I'd like to leave you with about missionary activity. So we have traders, we have diplomats, we have a variety of people making inroads into Korea in the 19th century, but you also have missionaries. And so, I'm a little bit leery of giving you the sense, Korean victim, Western Japanese aggressor, right? Life is not that simple. You can't just have this dichotomy of, these people are innocent and oppressed, right? And these people have the power and they're all evil, right? History is much more complicated than that. And so an interesting group to look at are Christian missionaries. As I say, right, the Japanese who controlled Korea as their colony weren't Christian themselves, but there were some Japanese Christians who went to Korea actually and engaged in missionary activity. This is a very new area of research. There was a book published on this recently of Japanese Christians, kind of from the countryside, who went to Korea and really saw themselves in solidarity with their fellow Asians. I mean, they were Christians. They said, look, we want to preach the gospel. We want to convert our Korean brothers, and this will be to all of our benefit. But they were really the minority. We'll talk about kind of why they got kicked out or stopped their activity by 1919. But I think for our purposes, what I want to impress upon you is that Western missionaries, especially American missionaries, they looked at the Korean Peninsula like they did in a variety of areas around the world when they were sending missionaries, and they kind of carved up, you could say, spheres of influence, right? So the Methodists would take this area, the Presbyterians would take this area, and they would set up churches, and they would engage in missionary activity. And so some of you may have heard this. North Korea, obviously been in the news a lot lately, and in North Korea, in Pyongyang, in the capital, that was actually a very vibrant center of Christianity. So we'll come back to this in a little bit, but I want to leave you with that, especially kind of the multifaceted kinds of engagements that people were having. It wasn't just trade, it wasn't just politics in this realm of spiritual life and, you know, what does it mean to think about the afterlife, that these are also changes that were pretty profound that were happening in the 19th century. Okay, so this late 19th century world order that you've got regional changes, right? So diplomatically, right, the changes are very stark, especially some of the visuals. So if you think about these kind of Confucian tributary missions, Korean officials going to Beijing and kowtowing in front of the Chinese emperor, right? That's in a sense what diplomacy was. It was very ritualized. The titles were very important. And so the diplomatic shifts now, you have this notion of equal sovereign nation states. Right? This is actually kind of new. I mean, do we have history teachers, high school history teachers in the group here? I mean, some of you may teach about the Treaty of Westphalia and, right, nation states going back to 17th century in Europe. But for our purposes, right, the shift to think about in diplomatic sphere is if you got this very highly ritualized Confucian world order, Sinocentric world order, that's based on morality, right? A Yanbang official studies the Confucian canon, and what you do by studying is you become a moral being, right? You're part of this hierarchy. And so this is very different now if you're a Western diplomat, right? You wear something like the Abe Lincoln hat in the mid-19th or late 19th century, right? You stand up straight and you shake hands, right? I do this with my class, right? Can you stand up for a second? Right, so in diplomacy, or think about it, right? Let's pretend I'm Trump and you're Kim Jong-un, right? What are we going to do in the diplomatic sphere? You're going to get down on the ground and kowtow to me like that? Right? How do you do a handshake in Western diplomatic tradition? Right? You've got a good handshake. Right? So this is something, thank you. This is something that's really different, is the body language and these kind of personal interactions in the diplomatic sphere. So this is something, again, that the Koreans kind of get swooped up in a way that is tied also to the economic push, right? The quest for natural resources and things like that, the gunboats and the Opium War, right? It was kind of a push for natural resources tied to these new diplomatic ties, right? Intellectual, the notion of social Darwinism and the social changes. So a real shift in the Confucian order. If you remember at the very bottom, anybody remember the classes at the very bottom of a Confucian social structure? Is slaves, yes, sorry. Above that is merchants, right? And so what Jennifer, how she explained it was that merchants just kind of live off of other people's activity. But a key element that you'll find in the Confucian classics about merchants, right, one of the reasons why they're so low is they don't produce anything, right? They're not productive. And so this has been part of a very long tradition. And so this gets overturned now, right? They see the kind of power that merchants have on these gunboats, right? Inevitably now part of a global capitalist sphere. And so the role of merchants and their social status really changes now. So this is the date that I gave you before about the Japanese kind of turning around real quickly in 20 years, engaging in this gunboat diplomacy, making the Koreans sign this treaty. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but these are a couple of military conflicts. If I had all history teachers and kind of geeks about military warfare and things like that, we could talk a whole hour just about the Sino-Japanese War. But what I want to leave you with is that this is part of a sea change in regional relations between the countries. So whereas China had been the center of civilization, now, by 1895, they lose to the Japanese. Right, they're defeated in the Opium War, they lose to the Japanese, they've got to pay these reparations. Not only do they lose to the Japanese, they've got to pay a lot of money, and then the Japanese use that to build up their military industry even more in 1895. So Korea kind of is stuck in the middle because they've had a relationship with China that doesn't really fit in to the model and the definition of how countries deal with each other, according to the Western imperialist powers. So basically what the Japanese government does is say, look, right, China doesn't control Korea, right? Korea's its own thing. Well, then what do you think happens? That gives the Japanese then the leeway to say, right, if they're not controlled by someone else, oops, that's ours, right? So they do that 10 years later, right? The Japanese defeat the Russians, huge sea change in terms especially of, we talked about social Darwinism and you know, this is based on race and skin color oftentimes, this notion of what it means to be civilized, what it means to be the fittest, means really to be the whitest at this point in history, according to Western imperialist powers. So when the Russians, right, are defeated, this really changes things by 1905. And here the implications for Korea are severe, that they're taken over as what we call a protectorate. And I'm using little air quotes here because protectorate is the same kind of language, sorry, was it George mentioned that the Americans use for the Philippines, right? We're going to protect you. So the Japanese adopt that language with the Koreans, right? We're going to protect you. You're going to be our protectorate, right? What they do is they take over all international relations. The Korean officials have no autonomy and say over their relations with outside powers. That's all Japanese officials now in 1905 doing that. The army and the police. Those are other institutions now that the Koreans really see you know, the hierarchy taking hold in terms of who's in charge. So, right, when we think about, okay, you guys all raise your hands when we think about Japanese-Korean tensions today, right, this is the backdrop for it, that here, right, we've got different notions of civilization, we've got different notions of who's in charge, and so by actually, sorry, before I move on here, just that last point here about the role of the U.S. and the Philippines. Basically, this is another area where it doesn't get a lot of press here in the United States, that the United States basically brokered the deal to end the Russo-Japanese War, right? What the Americans said was, okay, Japan, if you stay out of the Philippines, right, let us do what we want to do as the American imperialist power in the Philippines. We'll leave you alone in Korea. Have at it, right? Do your thing. So this is geopolitics. This is kind of brokering. This is making deals on the international stage. And so now that, especially South Korea, obviously, and the United States are such strong allies, right? That piece of geopolitics and that kind of basically selling Korea away in your own self-interest, that doesn't get a lot of play. But I think it's important to recognize, right, these kinds of diplomatic, you want to call it shenanigans, right, that are going on. And from a long-term historical perspective, maybe how somebody like Kim Jong-un, if he thinks about these kinds of historical issues at all, might go back and say, oh, wait a minute, right? The Americans have a long history of kind of selling us out, right? So I'm not saying I want you to agree with that or not, but that this is, you know, part, if there's a suspicion towards the United States or Western imperialist powers, that you can construct a history that would support that kind of criticism. Right, so I talked about the protectorate status, and so by 1910, you've got Korea becoming a full-on colony. And so usually what I want to give you a sense of is, even I start off my talk saying, you know, the brutal occupation by Japan of the Korean Peninsula. Yes, especially in historical memory, there are a lot of brutal things about it, but I think as a historian, if we're going to look at the historical evidence, what we want to do is get a sense of some of the distinct changes over this 35, 36-year period. And so the first 9 years or so was a time when the Japanese officials came in, there was extensive land reform, right? It had really been based more on custom and tradition and where your family lived in terms of what land you tilled and how it was taxed. That this is a very different kind of system now of land reform in the early 1910s. You've got to register at a city office, right? There's got to be kind of a modern bureaucratic system that you're a part of in order for you to stay on your land. So the important thing, and I think for us here in Southern California, the implication of this is a lot of Korean peasants got displaced from their land, right? If they didn't register properly, or if they weren't kind of part of this new modern imperialist system, that there were people who fell through the cracks. And so they went to a variety of places. There's an interesting book recently that talks about Koreans who went up to the Soviet Far East. By the 1930s, that's another lecture, but there's a Korean diasporic population in Russia because of this land displacement. We can trace it back to the early 1910s. The rural displacement also created kind of a sense of animosity, right? The sense that, look, we were more civilized, but right here comes the Japanese. They're supposed to have this kind of common Confucian notion of a moral, benevolent leader, and then you have, so there's always these kinds of disparities, or that's what I'm looking for, kind of differences in the rhetoric in terms of, right, we're trying to enlighten you, like what the officials are saying, and then the actual effect, especially people in the lower ranks of the social structure. By 1919, has anyone heard of this, the March 1st movement, or this date ring a bell for anybody? So this is kind of one of these aspects of Korean history, right? Whether you're North Korean, whether you're South Korean, whether you're part of the Korean diaspora, right? That this really has meaning as an important date in Korean history, kind of like Arirang. We were talking about the song Arirang before, right? Whether you're North Korean, South Korean, part of the Korean diaspora, right? You know Arirang, you can sing it, you love it, right? It's part of your Korean identity. So the March 1st movement basically was a national uprising of people in different parts of Korea calling for independence. And so if you think of the time period, right, what's going on globally? Let's go back to our global perspective. What's happening in 1919 around the world? First World War. So, right, again, March 1st is important for all Koreans, but in terms of why so many Koreans of all social classes rose up and called for independence, right, the reasons that historians give for that differ depending on your politics. So, as you might imagine, in North Korea, they say, oh, it was Lenin, it was the Russian Revolution in 1917, right? That was the international solidarity and this notion of throwing off the yoke of imperialism that was the cause of the March 1st movement, right? If you think about now in South Korea, right, a lot of South Korean scholars would say, no, it was Woodrow Wilson, right? It was the 14 points, this call for national autonomy, right? The changes that happened, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. So, we can debate that as historians, but I think the important point for us here again is that Korean intellectuals in 1919, they went and they made international appeals with the help of Christian missionaries. So we go back to that group, right? They're not the bad guys, they're not necessarily always the good guys, but the missionaries are really the ones, they had a sense of how international politics work, and so they went to The Hague. You had Koreans, there's actually a little museum in The Hague that talks about Koreans who were really trying to appeal to an international audience, right? International global figures like Woodrow Wilson. Look, we want to be independent, right? But this is unfair. It was a brutal crackdown. This is the other thing that's important to know about the March 1st movement, is the Japanese very brutally suppressed this. So you've got cases of, for instance, a church in a southern part of the Korean peninsula, people being locked in and set on fire. So, extreme brutality and a kind of a vicious crackdown on the independence movement. And so, it wasn't successful. This is one of these cases in world history where the attempt to gain independence failed. And so what happens then in the next decade is is that the Japanese realize, okay, whoa, this is really bad for our international reputation. So, right, because the missionaries are in touch with their home bases, they're, you know, in touch with reporters, and so what you have now is a shift. But I don't want to overstate this, and I don't want you to get the wrong impression. The 1920s, what we call cultural policy, was basically a strategic move by the imperial government to have the Koreans be able to sort of let off a little steam, right? Be able to have certain avenues of nationalist expression, right? Expression in politics, expression in poetry, expression in literature, right? Expression in a variety of ways. However, right, it's important to note that it was always still controlled by the Japanese colonial government, right? It wasn't like, oh, you know, do whatever you want, publish whatever you think is, you know, part of your national heritage, right? It was very deliberately, carefully selected leaders of different kinds of cultural organizations who would cooperate with the Japanese colonial government to be able to publish magazines. So I think Jennifer, actually, who spoke before, you know, does some research on Korean women and writers in the 1920s. That was part of this cultural and intellectual ferment, right? It was a different time now in the 1920s, but right, you don't want to overstate the extent of the contrast because there was still very strong control by the Japanese imperial government with the backing, mind you, right, of other Western powers, right? They had their chance to intervene and help Korea. They didn't do it, and they weren't going to start in the 1920s. So by the 1930s, and this is, I think, one book that you have in your packet or have referenced, is the assimilation play, The Name Change, Lost Names. So this now brings us to kind of the third phase. So you've got the first decade of the 1910s, the 1920s, cultural policy. By the 1930s, you have a real ratcheting up of the military government in Japan. And so the implications for Korea are very severe. That it's a much different kind of policy now where they try and assimilate the Koreans into the Japanese empire in a new way, in a much more forceful, oppressive, aggressive way. That it seeps down into the very bottom levels of society. And so I think I actually used the book Lost Names in my class at Cal State Fullerton, and it's fiction. This is important. If you read Lost Names, you have to read the preface because the author, Richard Kim, he talks about when the first edition came out, people just thought it was a history book, that this was like a biography or a true story. Well, it is based on true events, but it's very important. I think some of you, are from other disciplines like English or, other disciplines that might have different ways of representing the past compared to a historical, empirical, positivist kind of approach. And so if we look at the 1930s and 40s, this assimilation policy included a couple of important things, right? It included the name change, so that you had to you had to change your name from a Korean name to a Japanese name. And I want to tell you a story about some research I did of Japanese officials. They had been in Korea in the 1940s. They come back from Korea in 1945. Japan loses. Hiroshima and Nagasaki's bombed, right? The Japanese lose. They give up their colonies. These officials come back. By the 1950s, there's some students that decide to do oral histories. Somebody mentioned back there an oral history project, right? So these oral histories are kind of interesting, right? So in 1958, okay, 20, 30 years ago, they asked these Japanese officials, well, what about this name change policy? Right? There's a lot of criticism that the Japanese forced the Koreans to change their name. This was one of their answers. The Japanese official says, well, they didn't have to change their name. And then there's a pause, and you see the transcript, and one of the students jumps in and says, but if you didn't change your name, you didn't get your rice rations. So do you have to change your name or not? If you want to eat, if you want to survive, right? So I think this is a very important point, right, in terms of how do you get people to do something they don't want to do, right? This is a humanistic question. This is not even necessarily a historical question. It can be a philosophical question, right? What is the nature of somebody being forced to do something? And so the forced name change, right, was because your livelihood was at stake. And so another important part of this name change that I want you to pay attention to as you're reading Richard Kim's book is the number of Koreans who kind of subverted this policy. So there's a book by a historian at Yale, James Scott, called Weapons of the Weak. And basically it says that people at the bottom rungs of society, they protest, they resist in everyday kinds of ways, right? They might not be out there like March 1st, 1919, because they know they're going to get locked up in a church and burned alive, but right, by the 1930s or 1940s, their way of resisting the name change is to say, okay, I'll change my name to Ishikawa, for instance. It's a Japanese name, right? Ishi means rock, kawa means river. And so the Chinese characters and the name itself actually has some connection to that family's history. So it's a way of kind of protecting your identity and saying, you know, screw you, Japanese official, I'm going to pick this name, you don't even know why, right? That you have that kind of power. It's not open, it's not confrontational, but it makes you feel better. And it makes, if you think about the Confucian importance of reverence for your ancestors, to change your name, how could you do that? What could be more disloyal to your family? What could be more of a rejection of your Korean heritage? And so to change it in a way like that, or to you know, have some other kind of way that you can resist but not openly. And so that's another thing I'd like to leave you with today, is that a lot of the scholars looking at the colonial period, their emphasis now is more on what were some of the mechanisms that Koreans used to resist, right? They weren't just passive victims. So I think this also, if we want to put this in global perspective, you know, we're right not too far from the Museum of Tolerance. If any of you, you know, teach about the Holocaust or, you know, other kinds of atrocities in world history, right? Didn't Jewish people resist, right? Weren't there people who spoke out, right? This notion of who collaborated and who resisted, that I think this also really has a lot of potential for cross, you know, comparative kinds of cases. And so in the case of Koreans, right, you've got this resistance in subtle ways to the name change policy. Right, by the 1930s, you've got talk of conscripting Korean soldiers, but this is something actually the Japanese government was a little leery of, because they didn't trust the Koreans to be loyal. So it kind of went in phases, and it didn't really apply to all Korean men. But I'm just giving you a couple of key dates that are really a turning point in terms of the expansion of Japanese militarism, and then the impact that it had on Korea, both in terms of Korea being more important for natural resources. So oftentimes in terms of geography, you may have covered this, we call the southern part of the Korean peninsula kind of a breadbasket, more agriculturally focused, as opposed to the north has more minerals and coal and things like that. Hydroelectric plants are something that the Japanese built there. So that kind of industrialization then fed into the Japanese military expansion by the 1930s and 40s. 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure I hit all of these here. Are there any questions before I continue? I'm getting the 15-minute mark. Yeah?
Did the Japanese intermarry with the Koreans?
Interesting.
That's a strategy that people do.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, the intermarriage. So yes, there were cases. One of the things, we talked about the difference between Korea being colonized by a country like Japan that was so close geographically. One of the other kind of distinct features about Korean colonialism is that most of the Japanese who were there lived in urban centers, that there was a push by the Japanese government to try and get these farm villages and farmers to move to Korea, but didn't work. That was actually a failure on the part of the Japanese. But there was success, not necessarily deliberately, of shopkeepers, businessmen, traders, people in the ports, port cities, and so there are cases, particularly of Japanese men and Korean women. That's the most common strategy. To be honest with you, off the top of my head, of all the historical records I've looked at, I can't think of a specific example of a Korean man and a Japanese woman, but there may have been cases of that. And this, I'm glad you asked that question, because when we get to after 1945, this becomes kind of a problem. Who's the enemy, right? The Japanese was the enemy. If you're a Korean woman married to a Japanese man, you've got a Japanese name, you're kind of Japanese. but wait a minute, weren't the Koreans the victims in all of this? So there are kind of some messy cases. But yes, there was some intermarriage. You know, I have to think about that more. That doesn't get highlighted a lot in the historiography or in kind of the personal stories that people tell from that time period.
Well, there's different groups, like for the French intermarried into the native population. The British did not. So there's certain groups that just won't do it.
Yeah.
Certain groups who see it as strategic.
Yeah, so if we put this in like kind of a three-point historical comparative perspective, right, the British, the French, and the Japanese, I would say, again, I have to look at this in more detail, and I'll leave my cards here too if anyone wants to follow up on questions that you didn't get a sufficient answer to. But my sense is that the Japanese were much more aware of things like the family registry, for instance, and so to have a Korean woman then be part of your family registry, that there might be resistance to that. Because there was always this discrepancy between the rhetoric of, you know, all Asians under one roof, or, one body, two people, one body, that kind of thing. There was always a contradiction between the rhetoric and the reality, and because that hierarchy was always there. So my sense is that, and just from studying this for 20 years, that it wasn't necessarily a deliberate strategy to intermarry. But the wartime, the wartime mobilization, this may actually play into that, how the Japanese government used Korean women very deliberately, especially because of that strong Confucian tradition, that when they were recruiting comfort women, basically sexual slaves, into the Japanese Imperial Army, that they were seen as kind of pure, more pure, so less suspect to having, a venereal disease or something like that. So they would be recruited deliberately for that reason. So if you look at it from that angle, then again, it depends who you're talking about. So if we're talking about Japanese soldiers, their interactions with Korean women, in this particular context, would be very different from potential marriage partner. So the wartime mobilization, I put also the Korean diaspora there, because what you have by the 1940s is the recruitment of Koreans to do things like work in coal mines, in wartime factories, making parachutes and things like that in Japan and other places around East Asia. And so you've got now another wave of the Korean diaspora of ethnic Koreans, especially who were recruited for things like this kind of dangerous, dirty work in places like coal mines and factories. And still today in Japan, this is actually my area of research, is ethnic Koreans who ended up, for a variety of reasons, staying in Japan till today. So you've got ethnic Korean schools in Japan, right? There's a university in Tokyo that's an ethnic Korean university associated with North Korea. You go on the school ground, there's a big picture of Kim Il-sung, and so that's a legacy of the Korean diaspora that goes back to the 1940s. The comfort women, you may be familiar with the statue up in Glendale. There have been a couple of other attempts to establish statues, one in Fullerton, which was initially approved by the city council and then ran into opposition, and now it's not there. But this notion that Korean comfort women should be commemorated, a lot of this push and kind of the support and aid for these women to be able to speak out and tell their really horrific, traumatic stories is linked to feminist organizations in Korea and Japan working together. So when I walked in this morning, I heard Jennifer talking about the role of women, and so this is really important for the comfort women issue. And again, it transcends this, Japanese aggressor, Korean victim kind of paradigm if we're looking at international women's groups who have really tried to call to task somebody like Prime Minister Abe and the conservative nationalists in Japan, that there's an international coalition from Philippines and China and other places around the world. Tokyo war crimes trials, we talk about post-colonial legacies, so Japan's defeated. There are actually a number of war crimes trials around Asia, but one of the really tragic things that I put up here is that because Korea was a colony, some of them were conscripted into the Japanese Imperial Army, as I said. Some of them, again, because they were more lower ranking, the kinds of jobs that they had would be a prison guard at a POW camp. So when the Tokyo trials, basically the Asian equivalent of Nuremberg, right, this is happening in the late 40s, that the Americans can identify the prison guards, right, or the Allied power soldiers, Americans, British, Australian, right? So they say, hey, that's the guy, right, who beat me. That's the guy who locked me up. And so forget about the Japanese official back in Tokyo who was ordering it and trying to, you know, design this whole thing, right? It's oftentimes the people at the lowest rank. So here's another, this actually just kind of came to me as I was speaking about, you know, what's the role of low-ranking soldiers if we look at Abu Ghraib or we look at Guantanamo, that, you know, these kinds of military hierarchies, oftentimes it's the men and women at the lowest rungs of the ladder who really end up taking the brunt of other people's decisions. The territorial disputes, Ducto, I've put up there as something to think about as a post-colonial legacy because, right, these borders, we talked about the mid-19th century changes, the Opium War, and, you know, places like the Philippines being colonized, you know, tit for tat kind of with Korea. When the war ends, you've got another redrawing, right? Now we're in the Cold War, right? By the time we get to 1945, we're talking about Cold War, right? And one way to think about the Cold War is, again, a very simplistic dichotomy, US-Soviets. Right, that's one way to think about the Cold War. But when we think about the Cold War in East Asia, right, what we want to think about is that MacArthur, right, the United States, General Douglas MacArthur, he was in charge of both Japan and South Korea. And so a lot of these boundaries and borders were in effect under his control. And so Ducto was actually kind of this area of kind of rocky islands that wasn't really prioritized for anybody's particular possession. I went to Stanford, to the Hoover Archives recently, and I found these reports of the American military. It was called the U.S. Military Government in Korea in 1948, I think it was. They were using, the American military was using Ducto as target practice, a bombing practice. And so, you know, this was one of these things where it was convenient. It was the U.S. military that was in control. And it becomes an area now that's widely disputed between Japan and Korea. The Japanese name they use is Takeshima. And so it's really kind of riled up nationalist rhetoric on both sides. In Japan, they actually issued a postage stamp that's named Takeshima. Right? If you go on the 60 freeway, you'll see a sign, like Ducto is Korean territory. So this is spread outside the East Asian region to give the message to an international community, look, right, we were screwed during the colonial period and there were these ways that the lines and boundaries were redrawn, but historically, if you look at the connection, right, that this should be Korean territory. And so technically it's still kind of recognized by international powers more as under Japan's jurisdiction, but it's one of these things that most diplomats, frankly, would just rather stay away from. Similar also to the East Sea, that if you look at some textbooks, it'll say Japan Sea. In the case of Korea, they call it the East Sea. And so this is another case where the South Korean government today has been very active in reaching a broad international audience to say, look, if you appreciate the history, the long-term history, right, go back to the Imjin Wars even, right? Jennifer mentioned that, the turtle ships of the 16th century, that we have historical evidence that talk about the labeling and the kind of close historical connections. I think there's some sort of like military base, but it's not some place where you would go and buy a house, no.
There's no Korean or no Japanese.
Yeah. I mean, in effect, there's kind of a difference between sort of the de facto control that's by Korea and the Korean military, so, but it's not civilians, yeah, it's definitely government related. And we only have 5 more minutes. I wasn't sure, to be honest with you, when they said early 20th century. Does that mean exactly 45, the 50, the halfway point? But I just want to leave you with a couple of things that divided Korea. And this is important because the resistance leaders, right, that second point there, Sigmund Rhee, during the colonial period, he was in places like Hawaii and Princeton and advocating for Korean independence and trying to make alliances with Western countries that way, right, diplomatically, as an intellectual, as opposed to Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader. He was involved more with this kind of violent guerrilla, right? Guerrilla, not the animal, but guerrilla la guerre, the French war, right? So guerrilla warfare, right? This kind of violent resistance to Japanese imperialism. A lot of what we know about Kim Il-sung actually comes from the police records of the Japanese, and so you've got this split. And what gives both sides legitimacy is, and the leaders their legitimacy, is their efforts at resistance to imperial control going back to the early 20th century. And so just want to make sure you have the dates. You'll probably be talking about this in more detail later, of the Korean War by 1950. And so this is also an important thing to keep in mind. I'll leave you with this last note, especially because today it is June 25th. And so a very significant date that most people around the world would say is the start of the Korean War. Right? If you're in North Korea, they would say it was the Americans and the South Koreans who started it, but it's important to have a sense between 1945, right, the peninsula is split, 48, the two states are established. Right? You have kind of skirmishes and military kind of confrontations that happened before June 25th, 1950. It's only on this date, back in 1950, that you have the start of an all-out war that, as we know, we don't have a peace treaty to, we just have a ceasefire. So, you know, it remains to be seen. When I was asked to do this section, I thought, gosh, what's going to happen between Trump and Kim Jong-un, and am I going to have to change my whole presentation? But it seems now that, you know, frankly, there aren't too many changes. One thing I did hear, some of you may have heard recently, the remains of some of the American soldiers that were missing in the Korean War were returned. So I would say that certainly is a diplomatic victory for Trump in that regard. So I'm going to...
The Americans also sent some remains also.
Yeah, kind of a mutual, yeah. So,
Wait, the Americans sent the remains to North Korea?
The Americans had some remains of some North Korean soldiers.
How? So is it the U.S. they found the remains, or?
it would have been in the South.
Oh,
Okay,
okay.
South.
Alright, so.
There was an exchange.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't hear about that.
There was an article, I think, in either Rudder or The Guardian, where the Americans were seen bringing 200 assays and to the floor of the embassy. Is North Korea and South Korea united in their, I don't know if it's animus or whatever toward Japan?
That's an interesting question. Do we have time to...
Is that what are they united in that? Their
One more minute.
feelings toward Japan to get their islands, disputed lands. I mean, just
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting question, right? Is North and South Korea united against Japan? They could be. But I think this is another one of those cases that I've mentioned a few times throughout the presentation of the disparity or the distinction between the rhetoric and the actual reality. So despite the oftentimes very cantankerous rhetoric between South Korea and Japan, they actually have very close ties, right? They're close economically, they're close culturally, they have a lot to lose. I mean, the joint military exercise, it wasn't just the US and South Korea, that included Japan, it included the soldiers on the military bases in places like Okinawa. So I would say that the potential is there, but I think that the actual ties are too strong for the rhetoric to transcend the reality, would be my response. Yeah.
When you talk about the division of Korea, are you talking about the 38th parallel?
Yeah.
And wasn't that because of General MacArthur's strategy to push the North Korea further back because the attack on South Korea?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different points here. Sorry, what's your name? Edgar. So what Edgar's talked about is, so the peninsula is split in 1945, and if you read, Bruce Cummings has written a 2-volume study of the Korean War, and he very meticulously maps out how the State Department officials kind of arbitrarily drew the line in 45 at the 38th parallel, especially so that Seoul would be in the American sphere of influence. And according to these records, that the Americans were actually surprised when the Soviets went for it. They were expecting some pushback and like, oh, okay, let's split it right there. Priorities and interests really were elsewhere in the world, right? We're talking about the end of World War II, so Korea was kind of an afterthought. So you've got the division then. Then you've got, in 1948, UN-monitored elections. is another case for comparative study of what's the role of the UN in, say, a place like Israel, or in the case of Korea, that the North didn't recognize the legitimacy of the UN monitored election. So right now you've got the two states. I think what you're talking about is MacArthur in 1950, with the start of the Korean War, right? His idea was to push back the North Koreans, and then by the time the Chinese People's Liberation Army got into the picture, right? It was MacArthur's strategy to try and push back, you know, across the Yellow River, the very northern tip of the northern North Korea. And that was when Truman stepped in and said, no, that's going too far, and basically gave MacArthur the axe. So, you know, that push that MacArthur wanted to make even further north, that wasn't until the Korean War had started.
Thank you very much for your wonderful